around the globe. It's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus, providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and a special election edition of our World Affairs Roundup. In just a few days, we'll finally reach the end of a presidential campaign laden with superlatives, from the most expensive ever to the most, well, you can fill in the blanks. The race has been dominated by economic issues, but today our Roundup regulars will put aside questions of bailouts and tax breaks and who'll do what to grandma's health care and take a look at what the candidates have said about foreign policy. We'll also take a step back and discuss whether positions staked out on the campaign trail have any relevance to the policies taken by the eventual occupant of the Oval Office. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'd like to start, if we could, with two quotes that I think sort of frame our discussion today. The first is by George Freeman, the CEO of Stratfor, a private intelligence company, in which he says the president is trapped by public opinion, congressional intrusion, and above all, by the realities of geopolitics. Candidates will say what they need to say to be elected, but even when they say what they mean, they will not necessarily be able to pursue their goals. The choice to do so is simply not up to them. So, and more terse, we have the former governor of Illinois in a quote which he offered Richard Nixon as he was prepping for his debate with John Kennedy in 1960. You can say all you want about foreign affairs, but what's really important is the price of hogs in Chicago and St. Louis. So, John, maybe we can start with you.
Amen.
Amen. Well, and thank you, and we'll see you next week. Well, what about this? I mean, can we place any predictive value in what we hear on the campaign trail in the area of foreign affairs?
Well, certainly not since World War II. Our presidents and the presidential candidates have said any number of outrageous things during the campaign, as was pointed out, to get elected. But when you get to the office, there are all kinds of pressures and inhibitions and frustrations that would, even if you really meant to do what you said you wanted to do, it will frustrate you.
So, Ann, what about that? I mean, what basis can we decide if we're interested in foreign policy, who we should vote for?
Well, I think there are some clues, but they're not hard and fast clues. I think that one of the things that is helpful is to look at the foreign policy advisors that they put around them and see whether those people have been in government before and what kind of views they've espoused. I mean, certainly with George W. Bush, and I think with President Obama as well, the foreign policy advisors they had in the campaigns did suggest directions that their foreign policies were going to go. I think also that you can try, it's hard, but you can try and get a sense of their overall worldview, which is, it's very general. It doesn't say how they'll act necessarily how they'll act in particular circumstances, but, are they more of a realist as, acting on self-interest with an emphasis on military strength? Are they more of an idealist? So you can get a sense of that, but it doesn't tell you how they'll act on particular issues.
So, Robert, if we take Ann's advice and sort of look at the people the candidates have surrounded themselves with, what do we make of the current pair we've got running?
Well, we have a record with President Obama, so we could talk about that. That's something that voters should take into account. It's a little harder with Romney. I agree that foreign policy discourse, especially in elections, doesn't match up very closely with foreign policy quite often, though there are clues, and there's also things they say which they get held to, so to speak, because they've made some commitment. So I think it's not totally detached, though I think it's a problem for our democracy if the way people are elected has nothing to do with what they'll do in foreign affairs. I don't think that's a good thing. But I think, frankly, and John and Ann can disagree on this, that Mitt Romney has been even more all over the place than most candidates, because you had him far to the right of Obama earlier, saying we shouldn't have pulled out of Iraq, and now in the final debate he seemed to be trying to track to the left and say, but also say we have to greatly increase military spending. So he's particularly difficult. I'd say another thing you could look at is how comfortable a candidate looks with foreign affairs, because the less versed and comfortable they are, the more they will simply do what the institutions ask them to do, the State Department, Department of Defense, etc. So it means they'll be a weaker leader in foreign affairs, at least until they get their feet wet many months into the administration.
Well, that's true of every president that comes in, even those that are strong. It generally takes them a year before they get their people into the office, the Secretary of State and Defense and others, so that there is from looking at it from the field's perspective, there was a continuum of foreign policy, regardless of who the president was, for at least a year. Also, when you look at the foreign policy issue in the campaign, the president, assuming that there hasn't been something untoward happening in their presidency, they have a natural advantage. If you look at Jimmy Carter and the hostage issue, that was one of those things that stands out as being an ulcer that affected the overall election. But in this case, Obama has pulled out of Iraq. He is pulling out of Afghanistan. We can quibble about some of the ways in which this is being done, but there isn't any particular foreign policy issue that Romney can grab onto, other than what seems to be the prominent one, and the relationship with Israel.
And Benghazi. They're trying to hold on to it.
Yes, trying very hard to make it Benghazi, but it's not sticking, despite all the tweets.
Yes.
Well, what about the second quote about what's paramount in voters' minds is the price of hogs? There was a Gallup poll conducted October 15th and 16th in which the question was, what is the most important problem facing our nation? And no foreign policy issue rose above 4%. So
I think that it's interesting because the line between domestic and foreign policy is greatly blurred now. And I read earlier today an article that Richard Haas, the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, wrote about this very fact and how foreign policy debates are an anachronism, because really what we're talking about is blurred lines and immigration, energy policies, any kind of trade policies, even our relationship, everything related to our relationship with China is blurred in that respect. But many, many issues that climate change hasn't come up that much in all of this, but it is actually a central issue. And so I think that it is really hard to separate the two, and that maybe it was easier before. Because what the point of the argument was that, now in this era of globalization, we just can't.
Well, when I was a boy, the percentage of our economy that was involved in foreign trade was in one figure, or very light two figures. It's changed to is over 70% now. Mm-hmm. That changes the dynamic. What I think what you're saying is that the people who are aware of what's happening recognize this, but the electorate does not.
They don't.
Well, I agree. There's a blurring, and you saw actually in the foreign policy debate, the third debate, they went into domestic affairs quite a lot. I think global warming's actually become more of an issue, shockingly, at the end because of Hurricane Sandy. It wasn't until Hurricane Sandy. But if you look at China, right? Romney positions it as if it's America versus China, even though we know darn well that American multinational corporations are the ones who develop China as a place to produce things in order to get cheaper goods. And so is that foreign policy? Is that the economy? To your question about how you test issues, a lot of very important issues don't test high enough themselves, but if they become questions, they fit into things such as what kind of leader this will be. Is this someone who will fight for me and represent me? So I think some foreign policy issues actually would test much higher because they reflect upon the kind of leader the person will be, even if the issue itself doesn't get picked off a list of what's my top issue as a voter.
Well, turning to another audience, Bruce Stokes at the Pew Research Center recently said Americans get to vote in this election, but the rest of the world has to deal with the consequences. And a BBC poll of 21,000 people in 21 countries asking just preference between the two candidates found that Obama had across the board 50% to Romney's 9%. Now,
oh my goodness.
What is the phenomenon there? I mean, why?
Incumbency.
Really? It comes down to that? It has nothing to do with...
I think it's what you see, the devil you know, as opposed to someone you don't know.
Except if you think about George W. Bush,
Yes,
who was terribly unpopular overseas in many, many places, I think the results would have been quite different in 2004. I think Obama still has this rock star kind of image abroad in many places, so that helps to explain some of that support.
Look, and I don't say this as a partisan. John may disagree with me, but I think, taking a step back, right, that the American Republican Party is the most conservative governing party in the developed world. And so they are far to the right of most other advanced industrial countries, and that's why a poll would come out that way. And then they're also seen in the developing world as not having any particular regard for those countries because there's sort of a very machismo, America will do what it wants and will lead and doesn't need to consult places like the UN where they may have to listen to the little countries. So I think that it's real, and it's because of where the American political spectrum is versus the rest of the world.
I was with you up until you said real. This is a perception.
Well, the perceptions are real.
George W. Bush did more aid assistance programs in Africa than any of his predecessors or his successor.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely.
And that was interesting, though. I think that was kind of the outlier of his foreign policy in a lot of ways. Though I agree he did that. It's very interesting,
but he came into office as a realist. And after 9/11, after the Iraqi, he switched to becoming an idealist in foreign affairs. And in fact, in my mind, that was his downfall because he got wrapped up in something that we couldn't follow through on.
See, I think he became a hyper-realist, but John and I have had this debate before on the show.
Yes.
Well, what about on specific issues? Take China, for example. I think at least in the early part of the campaign, Governor Romney has staked out a much more muscular posture vis-a-vis China. Do you think, that colors their perception? Or are they just as jaded and say none of it really matters? We know they're just going to sort of have business as usual regardless of who's elected?
I can't imagine any leader of any country or the citizens of any country want to hear about whether we're talking about the Russians or the Chinese, the Belarus or whoever, want to hear another country talking badly about them.
And I think with respect to China, the fact that they will have a new leader elected the day after ours is, on Thursday, is really interesting because he's coming into office with wanting to, there's all sorts of speculation about which way he'll turn. So you will have a completely new slate, really, to work with because there's going to be a larger change in leadership there, too.
Great. Well, when we come back, let's drill down into some of the specifics, but right now we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're discussing the role of foreign policy in the presidential campaign. We've been speaking very general terms. Now let's look at some specifics, starting with something that's figured prominently, and that's Iran. Have we seen anything, both in the final foreign policy debate and the run-up to it, that would put a great deal of daylight between the two candidates?
Well, I mean, Romney's posture has been that the sanctions aren't strong enough and that we need to draw some line in the sand and say that we will attack Iran if they put their toe beyond this line, which is, I don't know, a very bellicose position, and tried to say that this means that we're not really behind Israel and that Obama has a terrible relationship with Israel. So as far as practical policy, though, I don't really know that that's an operational policy. I'd agree with John. It's just, but it's going to have implications because the rhetoric is heard in Iran, right? And they can't just go and say, oh, we didn't really mean it, don't worry. It's still going to have some impact later.
In 1952, Eisenhower attacked Truman's policy as being much too concessional, incompetent, and 6 years later he endorsed that Truman's policies in Korea as his own victory. So let's not get caught up in, when we get into the details is where I think we have the danger of running amok.
And I think it's hard when you look at Iran. I mean, how many options do we have? We're pushing sanctions absolutely as far as we can, and Romney said he wanted to strengthen the sanctions, but Obama has been doing that. And so the next option, it would seem to me, is a military strike, and I don't think there's much support for that, nor do we have the resources to do that.
So, I mean, I think most analysts agree that Governor Romney seemed to have backed off from that more bellicose position late in the campaign. Do you think part of it was that perception that there was just no stomach on the part of the electorate for more boots on the ground anywhere?
Well, there's also primary campaign where he needed to be bellicose and build up his base, and then it's trying to get swing and women voters late in the election. So he, pivots, so to speak, as they say among political professionals. But he is also still stating this thing that somehow we shouldn't wait for other countries to do it, that we should, and this is the Republican position, right? But the problem is that sanctions don't really work unless you have everyone cooperating with you, so it's not a sensical position.
There's another area that we might want to look at, and that's the relationship, and this comes back to Israel as well. There are three countries that come to mind where the domestic factor has a very important influence over what we decide on foreign affairs. There's the Armenian-Turkey issue, with the Armenians being particularly outspoken on the issue. Mm-hmm. And then we have the Cuban issue, which we talked about over at our little confab on the lake.
This is about Romney promising to take out Fidel Castro basically multiple times, right? So you're being delicate, but so our audience knows.
There is nothing delicate about Robert. And then we have the Israeli issue, which is both a foreign policy, mostly because of where it's located, and it's a domestic issue because there is an incredibly powerful lobby for Israel in the United States. And it affects the way in which, when candidates go and talk to various organizations, we seem to freeze them at that moment as this is where they stand. Well, if the president is talking to the veterans of foreign wars, this is hardly going to be a definitive statement about his position on foreign affairs. He's going to talk to a particular audience, and he's going to have particular things to say. So,
but it's broadcast now, right?
But do those kinds of constituencies, which can skew the rhetoric during a campaign, exert an equal influence once the person is elected? I mean, if you're considering your Cuba policy with an eye towards eventual re-election or having to face the electorate again, do you still have in mind those South Florida voters?
I think it has worked through almost every campaign so far.
It's the calculus, too, of where the votes are concentrated and how important that state is or set of states is in the election.
So if Cuban Americans were mostly in Wyoming, we would maybe have a different Cuba policy? Is that what you're saying?
I think so.
Well, unless they were, yes, yeah, that's a good point. But it's also the concentration.
The concentration
in a major battleground state that has a lot of electoral votes.
Yes.
Right. And it's an inflammatory issue that gets all emotional. So,
very emotional.
Yeah.
So what about something that's more specific? What about China and currency manipulation? I mean, Governor Romney has said unequivocally on his first day in office he will formally declare China as a currency manipulator. Can you walk something like that back
He's
easily?
had a very long first day in office. He's made a lot of first day in office promises.
Yes.
But
He's also
the
going to
problem, I
repeal
think, with
Obamacare.
that, it makes him seem strong on China, which is popular to the electorate, right? But you know, I mean, our Federal Reserve has done all sorts of manipulation of our currency. We're on QE, 3 or 4. So I think that the Chinese may have a defense here. But more importantly, our relations with China have to do with our multinational corporations, which are also behind the candidates. And so it's not a simple our economy versus theirs. It's a global economy.
I would doubt that a candidate would, after being elected president, would come into office and want to start on such a negative footing.
Right.
I mean, China is a very, very important state in the world, and I would be very unusual. Everything that I've read says nobody believes that he would actually do that.
So have we as a society gotten to the point where we don't hold people accountable when they say categorically, I will do X on day one, and they don't do it, and we just say, oh, well, that was just campaign rhetoric?
What do you mean got to the point? I think we have been at that point for a long time. That campaigns, especially before communications were so good. Harry Truman could go off to Independence, Missouri and make a speech that would appeal to the people there. And by the time the national media picked it up was a month or so after, and things had gone on, moved on. Right now, everything is instant, and there is very little analysis with the instant communication.
True.
I agree with John's general point, though. Communication was pretty good then. They had telegraphs and a lot of newspapers, but it wasn't quite as instant as what's on Twitter, what's on cable news, right? And it wasn't a picture of the person doing it in the same way.
And it
Right.
went through a
Internet.
filter. It went through the filter of a newspaper person who had a responsibility, or generally, that they were interpreting what this meant or how this fit into a broader context.
Right.
That doesn't happen with CNN.
And there isn't a serious effort in all these foreign policy issues to actually educate. It's about the spin. I mean, I know it is also on domestic policy, but so that many people aren't that interested in foreign policy, and then what they're getting is the spin. And the substance of the issue isn't really even less important.
Worse in foreign affairs because the public doesn't have any context itself. So if someone came up and said, oh, the economy's great, everyone wants a job, can get a job, people would say, well, it's not true, that's not my experience. If they say this country's horrible and this country's great, well, they have no way to check that fact at all.
No, it's very true.
So is there sort of a prevailing mood on the part of the electorate, do you think, that these candidates have tapped into? We talked a little bit about, sort of the lack of appetite for more interventionist policies. I mean, is there some sort of underlying sort of spirit that the campaign advisors are taking the temperature of and calibrating the rhetoric accordingly?
See, I think it's targeted, right? For Romney, he wants his base to say that, Buzz been weak, been on an apology tour, quote unquote, that kind of discourse, right? And he's going to be stronger. But for everyone else, he just wants to say, I'm qualified to be in foreign policy and elect me on the economy, I think. So I think he wants it to be a non-issue with the broad electorate, and he wants to look bellicose for his base to motivate them.
And what about on the president's side?
I think he wants to say, I'm the president, take advantage of incumbency. I've managed all these things. Not everything turned out right, but certainly I'm a competent commander-in-chief, and more importantly, I am the commander-in-chief.
And what we're saying is 4 years changes the dimension. And 4 years ago, he had no experience in foreign affairs, and now he has 4 years of it.
I think in the debate, especially the foreign policy debate, the strategy on Romney's part was to avoid saying anything that could come back to haunt him. So that was partly explaining the shift.
So if there's little predictive value in any individual remarks a candidate might make. Can we discern anything about sort of the broad brush sense of where they would position America in the world from what they've said from this campaign, do you think?
Let's go back to what Ann said earlier. Look at the people who are advising them on foreign affairs. Where George W. Bush, especially after 9/11, was surrounded by the neocons, and that defined where he was going. Obama at first had a trio of the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of State, who were being the realists in terms of our foreign policy. That shifted now, and Hillary Clinton has joined Susan Rice and Samantha Powers as part of an idealistic approach. So that more defines where presidents are going. Who are the people around them, and what are they saying and doing?
Yes, because at least they're not campaigning, and they have a record that we can look at.
I'd say there's also an interaction to domestic affairs here in that Romney's domestic policy is that we're going to change Medicare substantially, Medicaid substantially to free up money, not only for tax cuts, but to increase defense spending. And so it's more of a long-term commitment to be a policeman of the world, not to have our world power diminish, even if it means pulling back on a lot of domestic commitments. So that is a difference, I think and that changes your foreign policy.
Too, yeah.
But also, all of the cabinet members are campaigning. That goes with the territory.
Okay, well, we've got less than 30 seconds. I'm going to pin each of you down. Give me a winner and a percentage on Tuesday.
Wow.
Well, I mean, it's electoral votes. We don't have a system based on elections.
All right. Winner.
So, well, I'm going to say that Obama's going to win, but he could. The popular vote could be 50-50, but he's going to win the Electoral College.
I agree.
Romney's going to win.
We'll see. See you at the polls on Tuesday.
Information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,